that whole thing. Take two. Hi, my name is Vance Freno. I want to welcome you back to our golf performance series on the biomechanics of golf. I'm going to actually tilt my screen a pinch here. And today's subject matter is going to be the human spine. We're going to talk about how the spine has to react in the golf swing, and all the fundamentals of what you need to do to keep this nice and healthy. Before we do that, I just want to go over the previous talks. So our first introduction talk talked a little bit about what this series was going to be about, and it covered what we call nomenclature, terms within our field. So we have a little bit better understanding as you were watching. We talk about three planes of motion and what they are and what that means, how our body is constantly getting pushed down by gravity, pushed back by the earth, and how we have mass and momentum means that as my body or movement going through the system, we've got to be able to decelerate to accelerate to decelerate. And so that first video kind of covers some of those concepts. The video is breaking into the actual biomechanics started at the feet. And we looked at what the feet are our anchor. The feet are the light switches to these hips. So as I go to make any motion, it doesn't really matter if I'm going to throw, swing, even just walking, the roll of the foot in the ground, we covered what does it need to do in those three planes to anchor us properly as we go through the turn. When they do their job well, it allows these big muscles back here to engage and to do their job well. Next, part two was on the hips and pelvis. We talked about the role of the hip joint and how the hip joint has to have the ability to go through this flexion, how it needs to go through this flexion into extension, and then it's a lateral flexion and how it has to rotate. We talked about the role of when this hip goes through all three of those six motions to set up the power, and how it needs three of the other motions to help decelerate this at the end of the bookend. So from there, now we're going to start talking about how all that power coming from the ground up and through that pelvis is going to get transferred to the arms and eventually through the club. And that is through the spine. So just a quick anatomy lesson on the spine. So the spine is made up of three different segments. The top of your neck is your cervical spine. The mid, so if you reach in the back of your neck and there's a little bump back there, you feel that bump, okay, that's generally going to be your C7. Just below that begins the thoracic spine. Thoracic spine will go down to about here, and that is so your thoracic, and of course the lumbar spine. Most people know about the lumbar spine, not much is about the thoracic, because when we hurt our backs, it's generally the lumbar spine that gets hurt. And we're going to discuss a little bit using the anatomy of how and why that happens. So when we're looking at the spine, a couple of things to note. Now, again, you can palpate on your own back, or if you're with somebody, on the center of their back. You'll feel these bumps. Those are called your spinous processes, okay? Now, that's on the back side. On the front side, you'll see these bones are called vertebral bodies, and there's something called a disc. Anybody who's had an injured or herniated disc knows, that there's a little bit of a nucleus in that. If that gets pinched and it actually herniates, it creates a lot of pain and discomfort. Okay, now, so all these vertebral bodies, as they stack on each other, are held together by what are called facet joints. Now, I'm not sure if the camera will pick this up well, but the design of the facet joint determines the motion that segment of the spine would have. Now, in the lumbar, the way these are designed, the lumbar spine has the ability to flex and extend pretty well. It has a little bit ability to laterally flex, and it has virtually no rotation. So the lumbar spine is not designed to rotate, okay, based on how these facets. Now, as we move up into the thoracic spine is designed, it doesn't have a ton of flexion. It can get a little bit of extension through the thoracic. It has a fair amount of lateral bending or lateral flexion, and it has a lot of rotation, or technically it should have a lot. And again, the way these facet joints line up allow for that. We make our way up to the neck. Again, now the neck has pretty much the way the facets line up, allow it a lot of flexion and extension, a lot of lateral flexion, and a lot of rotation. So in all the three planes, in all the six motions, the cervical gives us the most. Again, the way their head is going to have to move and so forth. We're going to focus a little bit on the cervical on a couple of things, but our big focus today is this thoracic spine, because the lumbar spine is determined, its health and well-being is determined on what happens at the hips and what happens at the thoracic. In the foot, on our foot one, and we talked into the pelvis, I didn't really touch on the knee a lot, and the reason being is that the knee is caught between the foot and the hip. So if the foot or the hip are not working well, the knee gets torqued, and it can bother the knee quite a bit. Well, similarly, the hips are designed to have a lot of rotation. The thoracic spine has a lot of rotation, but this lumbar spine doesn't. There's only a few degrees between the segments. So if I don't rotate well at my hips, and if I don't rotate well at my thoracic spine, then my lumbar spine is going to take rotational forces. And we talked about how these facet joints don't like it. They're not designed for that. So if I take something that is not designed to rotate and I push pressure of rotation constantly into that area, eventually two things is going to break down. Sometimes they actually will fracture and people get these unstable spines. It's called spondylolisthesis, and they have to go in and have surgeries. Other times what will happen is as the facet joints are starting to rub doing that, they thicken. Bone will thicken when it rubs. And if anybody who watches this has spinal stenosis, that's generally what's happening. Where these nerve roots pass through are called neuroforamen. If the facet joint starts getting rubbed like that and starts building bone, what was once meant to be a nice canal space for the nerve pass through becomes narrowed and roughened, and then you have spinal stenosis, or foraminal stenosis technically in that. So, all right. So what we're going to talk now is going to take what's happening here at the spine up and into the golf swing. And what I'm going to try to do a little bit better than in the previous videos is not to get so maybe into the minutiae of the details exactly of what exactly every motion is. And as I do, the most important thing is not to try to, not knowing, remembering all that, but just understanding the complexity and what it has to go through. And then what are some of the ideas to try to keep that healthy? Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with stance. So as I get over the ball, so what we're going to look at a golfer for assessing is we talked last week about that proper hip hinge. And as the person sits here, we're looking is the curves in the back. We look in the lumbar spine should be a very gentle curve this way. It's called the lordotic curve. And then the cervical spine has that little bit of a very gentle kyphotic curve. So we're literally going to come up behind and we're looking, are those curves in their proper order? If they're hip hinge, they should be. What we will often see is a very kyphotic golf stance. In some cases, some people try to overcompensate and they're like in this kind of we call an S curve, or this really swayed back position, and we don't want that. If I'm in any of those two extremes, I can't rotate well, because within those three ranges, those three planes of motion, like when we have people who are really, they're in this how they walk, how their body, and they're very stiff in kyphosis, in this kyphotic position, and now they're trying to rotate the spine, the thoracic won't rotate. If it's taking up too much of this plane because my posture dictated that, it won't rotate well. I've got this stuff set up and it's just not going to go well. So we want to know that, are you in a pretty good position? Now, if somebody has a fixed kyphosis, there's a whole thing, we go through mobilization. That's not what this video is going to be about, but we're going to start looking at that. Are those curves in proper order? Now, as I start going through my backswing, we talked a little bit about that right rotation, how it loads the hip. So my pelvis and shoulders are both moving together. But now, as we start getting to the spine, we know that the shoulders are going to go a little bit further. Now, a couple of things in the thoracic spine, we mentioned that it has the ability to rotate and it had the ability to lateral bend. In golf, we're going to ask for it to do both of those things at the same time. So anytime these bones are doing more than one motion, one plane, we call it a coupling. So for golf, if I'm here and I go to make my turn, not only is my thoracic spine turning to the right, it's also laterally bending to the left because I got a ball down there. Okay, so I had this thoracic coupling going on. So as we watch that backswing, as we're taking people, somebody through and we're assessing, we're looking, how can they get that rotation around and maintain their lateral flexion? Now, people oftentimes are tight. You'll see them coming and they start moving out of that. The body's not going to give them that motion. As we make our way up from the thoracic spine from that type 1 coupling, now the cervical spine is interesting because the cervical spine can be driven in a couple ways, in that we say one is just top down. So if I'm here talking to the camera and then somebody calls me and I turn, my body didn't move, my head turned, and I have left cervical rotation. But in the golf swing, that's not what happens. What happens in the golf swing is my head's relatively still, and I pull my arms around. That's a bottom-up driver. So that's an important component when we're assessing and when we're creating movement patterns, to make sure that we drive to allow the lower body to go faster than the head and to be able to create that rotation. We have also found in therapy, when people have neck issues, that some of the stretches we do here are not nearly as effective as when we keep the eyes fixed on points and we start moving the arms in certain ways to force it from the bottom, and it frees the neck up a little bit better. So again, now if you notice, I jumped over the lumbar spine. I'm not going to even really talk about that, because the lumbar spine is that basically that torque converter. So that's thoracic. The lumbar spine is here, thoracic stacking on top. When my pelvis turns, this lumbar spine goes with it with just a little bit of gentle, a couple degrees of rotation, and then the thoracic is what has to pick it up. So as I mentioned about the hips, if the hips don't rotate, the lumbar spine gets beat up. Same thing, if the thoracic spine doesn't rotate, the lumbar spine tends to get beat up. If I am tight in rotation of the hip and the thoracic spine, my lumbar spine doesn't have a whole lot of chance in that situation. Now, you may say, well, I'm lacking those, but I still hit a good golf ball. And there's a lot to be said about that. I just had a talk with one of the members, and he's missing a lot of motion. He's a good player. He hits the ball pretty nicely. He is a good athlete, and he's learned to compensate. So if I can, these don't separate well, but I've learned to move it together and hit my ball, because I've been doing it for the last 40 plus years. That's fine. Why I think it's important to start trying to achieve, because he said, he goes, well, what's the big deal if I don't have that motion? I'm playing golf. And it might not enhance the golf game so much, but it might enhance your life. If you're 72 and you're limiting motion, and you want to play golf up into your 80s, that limitation eventually can start costing you down the road. So we're not going to free somebody who's 70 years old up to where they were when they were 20, but any degree of motion, and this goes for anything we discuss. If my hip is blocked and it doesn't give me the full amount of motion that I need, but I can pick up a few degrees, that matters. Same with the spine. So we're going to, so we have a variety of techniques and movements that we're going to do for that. Now, so that was our backswing. So one more time, thoracic spine rotated right, laterally bent left. My eyes are over the ball. I get big cervical rotation. Yes, big cervical rotation, a little bit of a lateral bend in this position. Now on the downswing, we're going to go right to the impact. Now note, my body's all this wound up. Now I'm going to say, okay, spine, I need you to go from here to here in an instant. And if I'm unloading and I'm coming in here, now I am rotated left, laterally bending right, completely opposite what I had here. Now my neck went from left cervical rotation and lateral flexion to right cervical rotation, right lateral flexion. So I have asked my spine on the fly to change those directions. Again, it takes a certain level of mobility, a certain amount of strength to do that safely, where your body's going to work together to create that. And then in the follow through, as I get to my follow through position, again, I get up to this position and I get into a little bit of right lateral flexion. I have left rotation, and there's actually a pinch of extension, as there is. I didn't mention the extension part on the backswing. There is an extension piece on this end. We're going to cover those 3 planes. So just as the overview, not worrying about the details, you have to understand how much motion that spine needs to make, be able to drive through and change on a second there, and then be able to decelerate all that force coming up from that club as that club is swinging completely around. And it takes a lot. So when we're looking at assessing these motions, there's a lot of ways we go about it. Now, a question had come up about some of the videos. Hey, when you're done, can you give your top 3 exercises or top? And I will, on this video, I'm going to look to give a little bit more hands-on things to do. But there is no top 3 exercises. I might have a top 350 exercises. And it really depends on who's in front of me. And for example, what I mean for that, we're going to back up to the hips. So we talked about we want to get that flexion, this side motion, this lateral flexion or adduction, and the internal to get the hip. And now we just talked about thoracic. So an easy motion to create all three of that is to step with the right foot forward. We call it a forward lunge. I'm going to reach this hand across my body. I've now loaded this hip in all those planes. I have a big load here. And because my hand's reaching, I get that nice thoracic rotation, type 1, heads forward, and I get that cervical rotation. That's just a simple example. So if I say, hey, work on that, it's a great exercise, and then somebody has a stenosis or anything going on in their back, they might do that and it buckles them to their knees. So it's hard to say, hey, here's just a great exercise, everybody do it. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. In the end, do I want everybody to be able to hit every position? Absolutely. Will we get there? Probably not, depending on the age. If I have a 25-year-old golfer who has those glitches, no doubt I can clean them all. If I have somebody who's 75, I can clean some of them. We figure that out. We have to work together. Now, with that said, at the end, I'm going to give you a couple of simple mobility drills that will work through the thoracic. But the caveat is this: if you have any pain or any discomfort, you have to stop doing it. Don't, well, I can work it out, I'll work through it. Don't do that. I don't know what's happening in your spine. I haven't assessed you, and you're not in front of me to watch how your body's moving. Okay, so back into the assessment piece. So we talk about somebody getting into this position and what was required. So when we're looking at that from the assessment piece, what we're going to do is actually get somebody up into a backswing position, and then from here we assess what we call buffer zones. And I mentioned this last week. So if the motion of my spine were to fill a circle, call it the size of my fist, the buffer zone goes around that. So in other words, not only, so at the top of my backswing, my spine needs about this much motion. So from there, my question is, from here, can I create a little more extension? Can I create a little more lateral bending? And can I create a little more rotation? Do I have those buffers? Sometimes somebody's at the top of their backswing and you go to do that, nothing. I mean, okay, no, bend a little more. They can't. They're totally locked up. They hit the end of their motion and there's no buffer zone. And the buffer zone is important because it's going to help keep us protected so we don't want injuries. So we can literally go through a bunch of different, there's a million tweaks on this depending on what I'm seeing. So let's say, for example, in some of the global motions, I think that there's a tight left hip on the backswing. I can just set somebody up in the position, come back up and take my position here, and then watch. Can they still give me the thoracic motion and load this hip if it's the other side hip? So we play off of these different positions, and these are actually exercises. So oftentimes when I have assessment and they don't do great on that, I'll stand them back and I'll just say, hey, I want you to work on this until I see you next week. So I'm going to add a pinch to your list if you want. If you're watching, get up. And there's a couple of things we can do. So I'm going to go over some just fundamentals as far as where the spine is concerned. Let's get you into your golf stance. So if you're in your golf stance, I'm over the ball. A simple thing, I'm just going to take my hands here and I'm just going to lift. And as I lift my arms up, it's going to, we'll cover shoulder next week. Obviously, I need some shoulder flexion, but if you just feel the center of your back, and you should feel that center of the back going in. Now, a lot of you might not get that. And what happens at the center of the back, the thoracic doesn't go into that extension, the lumbar does. You're doing it, it's like, I feel it in my low back. That means your thoracic's not doing its job. Now, when we're assessing in non-COVID times, I literally just stand with my hand on the person's back. I watch it, but I put my hand there. Anybody who's worked with me who might watch this, in the, have seen me in the true strip, I just put my hand there. And I just watch as they're going through the motion. Can they give me any extension? Okay, then from that position, again, back in my golf stance, now my hands are here, and I'm just gonna see, can they laterally bend? Is there any lateral bending going on? Now, I'm not looking for that big hip sway. I'm looking more just what's happening here. Okay, again, a lot of times I'll hit my hands on there, and I'll just feel, is that spine moving in that position? And then, of course, lastly would be rotation. I'm in my stance here, and now on this, I'm trying to keep my lower body pretty quiet to see what kind of motion is going on in those three planes. And then we break it out from there. We could do, or we couple that whole coupling system And we just start breaking those drills down. And from the assessment piece becomes the homework piece. Okay, so we talked about the global motions of what the spine should do in those different areas. We talked about the golf-specific motions and what they have to do on that quick fly. And then we talked about our buffer zones and why we want to assess those in all of our different positions. My impact position, I'm going to do the same thing. I want to test to see how much motion. And of course, on the follow through, the buffer zone here, is there more extension? Is there more lateral flexion? And is there a little bit more rotation? So we can look at backswing, impact, follow through, and see, is your body giving you that? And again, start picking out some exercises that incorporate both the pelvis, hips and pelvis up into that spine to start giving you some of that motion. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to move the camera. I'm going to change the camera angle a little bit because I'm going to just give you a very simple mobilization drill that you can do and should be able to do safely. Again, if there's any pain, do not do it. So I'm going to come up to the camera. Bear with me here. And I'm going to sit up on the pole here. Okay, now I'm not sure how my lighting is going to be. Well, it looks like you might be getting my silhouette. So I get into my golf address position. I'm just going to put my hands down on the bar. Now there's something called the pelvic tilt, and sometimes we'll test the pelvic tilt, how well the motion can come in here. But then from here, I can set myself in my golf stance, and I can drive that pelvic tilt from this position. I can slide my hips left and right, try to drive that position. So I'm locking my hands, and now I'm moving my pelvis to mobilize the spine. And then the last one is a pelvic rotation, where I'm holding this position, and I rotate. Then I can come up to a higher position. Again, good golf stance, set my hands up on something a little bit higher. Everything similar. I'm going to drive that pelvic tilt, that lateral bending of the pelvic, that lateral flexion, and again, rotation. And I can set these patterns up in a variety of different ways. One last one we'll give you is I'm going to set myself up. I'll make myself a lefty here for the camera, where I'm going to come in. I'm going to create rotation. Again, if I were a left-handed golfer, I can sit here. Now, in here, I have a little pressure pushing off my left, holding with my right. You can see that motion we talked about in that thoracic spine. And then once I'm under a little bit of tension here, again, I'm going to do that pelvic. I'm going to drive my pelvis forward and back, left and right, and then in rotation, where I'm turning. And because this is anchored, it gives me that deep stretch across my back. So those are a couple. I'm going to spin our camera back to get our lighting a pinch better. So those are a couple of different mobility drills that are a good start. So I'm going to anchor the hands. I'm going to just gently drive the pelvis. And then even the one I showed you for our assessment, you can do that just coming here and see if you can create some of those motions. They're good starters. If you have pain, please do not do them. And just reach out to us. Any questions for any of the videos, any feedback, any comments, please put something in the comments section or feel free to email me. My email information is on the website. Again, I thank you for your time, and I'll see you next week.